Hello everyone, my name is Alexandre Mirlesse. I'm the former AI Special Advisor to the Paris Peace Forum. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome our speakers today for this session on AI innovation and development, or shall I say maybe to welcome you back. Because if I remember correctly, 1 year ago for the 7th Paris Peace Forum, we were all on stage already discussing AI, its effect on inequality in the world, on progress, on growth. And 1 year in terms of AI equals a decade. So we all feel a decade younger, taking this subject all over again. And let's see what are the trends that have shaped AI in the past few years. I'm joined on this panel by Mr. Thomas Lamanauskas, the Deputy Head of the International Telecommunications Union, by Gabriela Ramos, who led the first all-encompassing negotiation to adopt a recommendation on the ethics of AI as Deputy Head of the UNESCO in 2021, by Kate Kallot, who is the star of AI in Africa, former head of the Africa division at NVIDIA, and now building African-powered AI out of Nairobi with her startup Amini AI. She'll soon tell us more about that. And last but not least, Chris Sharrock, Vice President at Microsoft for UN Affairs. Without further ado, aussi pour parler un petit peu français,
we're here to speak a little bit of French, and I would like to cite something that Kate Kallot published yesterday in Le Monde. The history of African innovation is a history that is often too forgotten. Africa did not wait for smartphones to invent new technologies. This is precisely what is something that we have to be building. We have to be the ones building
Thank you,
AI.
For having me. It's a pleasure to be back to this stage 1 year later, where everything has changed. Maybe to elaborate a little bit on what I meant when I said it has to be built for us and by us when we think about AI innovation in Africa. You know, the M-Pesa moment was quite critical in the context of the continent, right? For those who are not familiar with what M-Pesa is, it is the mobile banking system in Kenya. And that was invented back in 2012. So way long before Apple Pay or WeChat Pay or Android Pay and all the ones that have been accelerated during COVID. So what I meant with the fact that it has to be designed for us and by us, it means it has to respect the local context, the context into which we are operating, the constraints into which we are operating. And it has to be adapted to the way we live, to the way we interact with each other, and to the way we see AI innovation going and developing in our countries. It has to be solving problems that we think are important for us on the continent and has to be adapted to where we believe we need to head towards to. So for me, it's a question of agency. It's a question of sovereignty, and it's a question of agency. We need to have the choice as to what is the best platform for us and whether we actually can build platforms for our own challenges and our own context.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm turning immediately to Thomas on this, because you just sketch out the case for leapfrog in Africa, for agency, for self-determination. But that also requires capacity, infrastructure, and tackling this digital divide that has been, plaguing this hope. Thomas, could you walk us through what the ITU is doing to that effect? And what's your personal take on whether AI is going to be the great divider or the great equalizer in the years to come?
No, thank you very much, Alexandre. Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you, Kate, for kicking us off. I think, indeed, that leapfrogging story is a continuous story in technology, you know? So you mentioned M-Pesa, but before we can talk about mobile technology versus fixed telephones, we can talk about even roaming, you know? So like East Africa was actually the first best integrated mobile roaming region where you can cross borders without paying charges, you know? So a lot of those things, those innovations came there, and they didn't come there because they were imposed or sourced from somewhere. They came there because they were adapted to the local environment. However, However, to have that, you still need to have foundational building blocks to allow that. And I think that's where the difference is. I think the solution should be local, but certain foundational building blocks, I think, it's difficult to avoid. And here, of course, we start about talking from infrastructure perspective. And of course, here, even when you talk about basic connectivity infrastructure, there's still a huge divergence. So when you talk about, like 2/3 of the global population connected, but like around 1/3 of the lower-income countries from Africa, that's a big divergence. When you talk about 5G, 90% plus, in the developed, in the Western world, where it's like a really, barely scratching the surface in Africa. So that's kind of infrastructure pieces there, and especially when we go now to the more hard infrastructure like data centers, Africa as a whole has just shy of 20% of global population, just shy of 2% of global data centers, and actually less than 1% of the data center capacity. So that's even because when there's numbers and capacity. And then when you look through that kind of other than areas, then it becomes evident that we need to kind of invest in that infrastructure. We need to invest in skills as well, because as well you need the people who have that ability to understand, how to create this. So because we need to move in the, so still we have a huge divide in the value chain. What they say from data labelers to PhD owning engineers who kind of create models, and that kind of value chain place also determines how much value you will capture from that data that you create and from ingenuity that you do. Some of the, UNCTAD, our colleagues just released a study, like 50% of data comes from, Africa. However, I think there's around 5% of value is captured from Africa. So it's like, how do you capture that value from that data there? And there you need infrastructure, you need the people who know what to do with that. And finally, you need policies, and the thing is, again, policies, which policies you have is a lot of times is a local understanding what you need, but you do need to kind of government drive around that. Again, if you look around the world, we still have a huge gap. Around 55% of the countries lack even policies on AI, 85% of countries lack regulations, and it's not only about teaching the policymakers how to do the regulations and on AI, it's also a thing, and that's where we had a great breakfast discussion this morning, is actually policymakers even understanding what AI is as well. And that's where, like, for example, what we at TU do is actually teach policymakers also actual AI skills. Now, just very quickly, but to kind of answering your direct question as well, so what we do as at TU. So in digital infrastructure, we have a thing called Digital Infrastructure Investment Initiative that we launched with Brazilian G20 at that time, together with 7 development finance institutions. At the Sevilla Financing for Development, we now transformed that together with our colleagues with UNCTAD and Rebecca to the Digital Infrastructure Investment Catalyzer to really galvanize investments in private sector investments, because we know public sector will not be enough to plug those infrastructure gaps. We estimated that that gap is around 2.6 to 2.8 trillion US dollars. Out of that, around 1.6 trillion is infrastructure. Other things is the policy and skills, not to forget that. So this is one of the areas we're looking into. On skills, we have our AI Skills Coalition with 60 more partners, really, like people like Microsoft, really connecting the content providers with the people that need it, and working now more and more on that. And as I mentioned on the policy, we just had a couple of weeks ago, training to the policymakers around 30 countries on the policies on that as well. A lot more to unpack as we go, but the work is happening. But back to what I said is, yes, ingenuity and local ingenuity is what's important, but we need to create a foundational platform for that.
I would say what we heard from Kate was the goal, the dream, a world where an AI-powered leapfrog is possible that brings us closer together. Then we have what it takes, infrastructure, investment, talent, policy efforts. And then, Gabriela, I'm turning to you because you're both very seasoned economists and diplomats, but you also had this task to bring 193 countries in a room before even AI was making the headlines and try to put it on our mental map and develop a toolbox for governments across the world to deal with the rise of AI in a manner that actually makes it useful and beneficial for everyone. Could you tell us how it happened, what lessons you draw from that? Maybe mention also the readiness assessment program that you spearheaded?
Well, thank you so much, and it's so great to be in the Paris Peace Forum, and I see the president here, so I'm very glad that he's joining us in this session. Let me start where you put the conversation, Alex. 1 year after, we were in the world of generative AI. Now we are in the world of agentic AI, and now reasoning AI. and the race to general AI. And so there is a world out there where we see that the capacities of these technologies are just exponentially getting far, far ahead. We're still in a world where 60% of these technologies are developed in the US and 20% in China, so it's still very unequal. But good news, the cost for developing models that are useful for countries, because not all of the countries need to go for foundational models. It's fine to have Microsoft here, but we don't need to do foundational models. But the cost for applications for smaller models fell 90% because of open source, but also because of DeepSeek and because of all this availability of the model. So I think that this is the good news, because we need to grab the opportunity. We need to see where do we just get it to ensure that we improve the way the services in the government are provided, the infrastructure, as Thomas was mentioning, the skills, all of these things are very important. So this is the context. The context needs to change because it continues to be highly unequal. But as you said, the experience that we had at UNESCO was to change the conversation, because it was a technological conversation. How do we chase the algorithm? How do we make sure that it's not biased? How do we get access to data? How do we ensure that whatever ingredients of these developments are understood better? And we put it into something that Thomas and Kate have underscored, which is, if the technologies are acquiring these amazing capacities, how do we make up for the capacities that we, citizens of the world, governments of the world, education systems of the world need, not only to take advantage of it, not only to apply it as they come, but to shape it? Because we have the tools to shape it. Policies matter, but also something that we learned, because what we did was to produce, as Alex mentioned, the readiness assessment methodology, a standardized evaluation of where countries stand to deliver on the recommendation on the ethics of AI. And to start, the recommendations on the ethics of AI was not about how you become more technologically savvy. It was about how do we ensure that these developments do not impinge on our human rights, on our human dignity, are sustainable and inclusive. And how do we ensure accountability? And how do we ensure transparency? And how do we protect the rule of law, by the way? If a young person commits suicide, who's to blame? If the algorithm discriminates against you and you don't receive a loan from the bank, who's to blame? So these changed the conversation, because at the end was our responsibility to ensure that all of these frameworks that we have built for decades are there to be delivered, and to, of course, to get into something there. Women, of course, Women for Ethical AI, only 22% of the workforce in the AI industry are women. And then, surprise, surprise, we are overrepresented in the digital harassment. So some things need to change. But at the end, the whole understanding of what countries need to do went down into 4 I's. Incentives, yes, use the procurement system and the tax systems and to bring more technologies that really comply with your rules. Infrastructure, as was mentioned, computing capacity. How do we leverage all the data that exists there in the governments that are not being used and that can really deliver for good, and actually to frame it according to our culture and according to our language? The question of institutions. The institutions need to evolve. Is the legal framework, who's in charge? France has a digital minister, an AI ministry, and the UAE has an AI ministry, only 2 countries. And finally, the whole point of understanding that these issues are in our hands to shape it. And we have that responsibility. Lots to be done, but because let me just finish with this comment. Out of the 80 countries that we're doing, and we go from the Netherlands to Mozambique to Chile, and they start changing their privacy laws or their cybersecurity laws, but only 30% of those countries have national AI strategies. Only 20% of those countries have the capacity to test the social impact of AI. And therefore, lots to be done to upscale the capacities. But it's a story of agency, as Kate said also, of us shaping these technological developments.
Thanks, Gabriela. I think it's always nice to have these catching phrases, especially for people with a weak memory like me, the 4 eyes. As a diplomat, I've grown up with the 5 eyes, which refers to a very different reality. But let's coin it and let's use it. Chris, I think it's the perfect moment for you to chime in. Would you, as a former diplomat, former ambassador, British ambassador to the OECD, who now works with one of the powerhouses of AI, one of these global AI superpowers, would you agree with this kind of 4 eyes doctrine? And if I may ask a subsidiary question, what would be, when you interact with governments, with civil society in the Global South, what is your answer to the voices claiming for more agency, more sovereignty on data, on models? What could be Microsoft's contribution to that debate?
No, well, look, thanks, Alex. I've got a terrible memory as well, so I'm afraid I've already forgotten the 4 eyes, but I'll try and remember and come back to it. But it's great to be here at the Paris Peace Forum. The conversation that we have very often around this subject puts me in mind of an old joke, just to begin on a sort of slightly light note. 2 guys are eating in a restaurant that they always go to. They order the food arrives, one turns to the other and says, I don't know why we come to this place, the food here is terrible. And the other one says, yeah, and it's such small portions. And this, at some level, this is, I think, the tone of the conversation we have, that on the one hand, we talk about the challenges that this powerful and disruptive technology is going to bring, and how do we solve those challenges? How do we make the foods digestible and nourishing? But underneath it, like, a lot of people want to have access to this technology. And I pay huge tribute to everything that Thomas and Gabriela have done, both through the work of the ITU and through the work at UNESCO and the RAM in particular. 80 countries. It's an amazing number. But there's clearly a lot more that needs to be done. And so in Microsoft, what we're really focused on is this question of diffusion. And we really believe that we have a responsibility as a company that is bringing this technology to market, recognizing the potential that it has to really transform society and the economy. We've got a responsibility to try and get it out there and get it out there for responsible use. So exactly as has already been talked about by Thomas, like, there is this fundamental question of infrastructure, and we've got to acknowledge that when you add up those who don't have access to electricity, those who don't have access to reliable broadband, those who don't have access to compute, the skills, the devices, it's roughly half the world that can't have meaningful access. So you've got to meet people where they are, as well as doing what you can to try and address that gap and that infrastructure gap. And the reason there's urgency needed in addressing that gap and really getting the diffusion and getting the access out there is because, as Gabriela said, there's exponential functions at work here. If there are increases in productivity that are accruing in advanced countries that have access to this, that can adopt it, that can transform their industries, train people to take advantage of the new jobs, connect to the digital economy, if that leads to productivity rises and GDP rises accordingly, whereas the other half of the world is not able to take advantage, then that gap that we already know exists is going to widen in an alarming way. And that's before you even get to some of the other gaps. Gabriela talked about the gender gap. There's a generational gap at play here as well. So we've got to really understand this diffusion picture. We've got to think about how we can address it. And then to come to your question, finally, that means you've got to have, I think, a degree of humility and approach the question through partnership. And I know Kate wrote an op-ed in Le Monde this week, which I just heard about, so I look forward to reading it. But I always love hearing Kate talk because she can tell us the reality of development and innovation in a position of scarcity in terms of access to compute. That's where we're going to learn. But then through the institutions, the international organizations, we can partner. Now, look, the ITU's been really tremendous. It's been really instrumental. A couple of things I'd like to to talk about. We are members of the Partnership for Skilling. Skilling is really, really key. We've got to make quick progress in helping people get the skills they need to access this technology. We've got a program in Microsoft called Elevate. We've put $4 billion behind this. We've got a target to train 20 million people worldwide. That's something that we're taking very, very seriously. And then the Partners to Connect program, which is quite long-standing now, has been another way that we've partnered, and others have partnered with the ITU on that aspect of connectivity. We had a commitment that I remember announcing at the Least Developed Countries conference in Doha a few years ago to connect 250 million people worldwide, 100 million of which are in Africa. By the end of this year, 2025, we are absolutely on track to do that, and that's thanks to the partnership with ITU. So we've got to deliver in partnership, but then we've also got to find a way to construct meaningful, enduring partnerships of action. And that's where actually I would just end by saying that's what this place is for. The multi-stakeholder vision of the Paris Peace Forum, which was engendered by President Macron, that's been driven by this team here. We should be thinking about some things that we can do here together. So I look forward to the conversation, delivering some of that as well.
Thank you, Chris. A few questions for the whole panelists before we open the floor. A friend of mine who might be in the room, I don't see him, yes, Adrien Becassis, who also works at the Paris Peace Forum. We're having this discussion lately about the Indian summits, the Indian Impact Summit. We're back from a trip to Delhi where we had heard about the goals of the Indian presidency for the summit. And our feeling was that the majority of the world could actually agree on a path towards AI sovereignty. That doesn't mean relying only on your own resources, that you will need some elements of your stack that come from abroad, but to retain a minimum of control and agency, as Kate said, over your data. India also has the same challenges that we have in Europe, that you have in Africa, which is to deploy, to have adoption of the technology. And it also has a riches of data. In the case of India, 1.4 billion people in 19 official languages. That's even truer in Africa, which is where the worth really lays. Kate, you started this discussion by saying, you know, we are at a crossroads where the tremendous value that will be created by the deployment of AI in the 5 years to come can either go into a few deep pockets or be spread equally. What would be the blueprint for national strategies, and you're advising a number of governments on that, to make it benefit the general population and to avoid this concentration?
So I'm going to be clear. The first thing is that we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. And by that, I mean that for decades, we've been fed technology that has not been built for us, and technology has been having the promise of really created local economic value for our population that we've not been able to grasp. As an example, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, the whole global south runs on those three platforms. But none of the economic value creation is actually located in our country. The woman in the village is able to use WhatsApp. The whole of government of Philippines runs on Facebook, but none of the actual tangible value is realized in our countries. We're still very much contained as consumers of technology and not actually being given the choice to build and shape what that truly is supposed to mean and mean for us as communities. So for me, it's really not making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I have hopes because, you know, if we think that AI is a new industrial revolution, today, developers in the global south are already learning how to refine their natural resources, which is their data. You know, we talk a lot about adoption, but the truth is we've been practicing AI for decades already. You know, there is this whole new movement about building small models, frugal AI, and such. Truth is, 8 years ago, there was a movement called tiny machine learning that looked at how to move the intelligence closer to where the data is being collected. So on-device, very efficient local intelligence. Kenya and Nigeria were some of the largest chapters in the world and have adopted this technology. Why? Because it's affordable, because it's something that they could actually go and put their hands on, and because developers have been very, very hungry to build solutions for themselves. But today, we go back to the infrastructure and the lack of adoption, I actually think that it comes more from a gap around being able to access the compute platforms that we need to build for ourselves. If we take the analogy of a restaurant, we're just asking tools to cook our own food. We're not asking for you to serve us ready cooked meals, right? That we don't even know. Let's say Kenya and France have very different regime. So why would we serve French cuisine or American cuisine or Chinese cuisine to a Kenyan kid? Right? So that's the reality. For me, we need to go back to understanding that today the situation is very different. We've already started to learn how to refine those natural resources. The only thing that we need is actually the tool to feed ourselves and build what we think is right for our countries. So when I go and talk to governments, the first thing they ask me is, listen, right now I have the choice between China and America. What do you think I should choose? My answer is none. You actually can build your own infrastructure. You actually can own your own infrastructure. And you have to shut down the biases that have been fed to us that the only way to do AI is to build hundreds of billions of supercomputers and large-scale data centers that will eat all your power, that will use connectivity that you don't have. But actually, there is a different way to do AI that is micro, that is efficient, that is looking at the minimum viable infrastructure that you need for your data to be sovereign and to be private. And that's the path you should go into. Just this morning, I was on the call with a government who told me, listen, you know, we are buying GPUs now, but everybody we're talking to doesn't actually understand our realities. They've just deployed like compute outside of Africa, but they don't understand that we still have 7 power cuts per day. Connectivity is still very difficult to access, but the reason why my op-ed was positive is because I already see that innovation coming. And, you know, I know the ITU is doing a lot of work around 5G and such, but I already see innovation around spectrum refarming that's happening in Africa that no one is talking about because the conversation is owned by very few actors in the world that are actually controlling the narrative. But if we just open our eyes, we would see that the innovation is already driven on the continent. And those problems around infrastructure, we're already thinking about solving it, but not solving it in the blueprint that we've been put to, solving it in a blueprint that we have picked and we have chosen for ourselves.
Thomas, how does the ITU answer to this very strong aspiration to agency, to self-determination? Every time I listen to Kate, I sometimes feel we're at the beginning of a kind of a new era of non-alignment. At least that rings a bell. And India will chair the next summit on AI, which will build on this tradition as well. Seen from the international organization's point of view, with these tensions between America and China and the aspiration of basically the rest of the world to still have some sense of self-determination and diversification in their partnerships, how do you answer to those needs?
So first of all, I think when we talk about non-alignment movement and others, we should remember that UN by itself, by its design, and ITU, one of the agencies, UNESCO agencies, were the club of member states, in which every country has one vote, one voice, one seat at the table, and they participate. So it's not like something that comes from the skies imposed on the countries. That's where the countries come together to co-create that future together. And I think that's where, sometimes we overvalue this whole, discrepancies in these views, because we have the forums where we come together and we have the forums where we discuss. And in that spirit, I have to be open. I don't like the word sovereignty. Because for a few reasons. First of all, it's an isolationist term, like this means I'm sovereign because I'm different from you. I'm sovereign means I'm protecting myself in this context from you. It's also very geopolitical. It's kind of, in that term, we kind of imply that conflict, like we imply the competition and conflict with others. I actually like the word resilience, in this way, because resilience is that I can be more resilient by connecting with you and by actually sharing resources and getting access to those resources rather than isolating myself from you. And I think that's kind of how we trying to see some of those things. Because when we talk now, it's about building capabilities of the countries to be able to service their future rather than building buildings, if you will, to have them. And I think sometimes this AI discussion, I think that's where the problem is. We talk about AI as if it's technology by itself. That's kind of once we have an AI, we have a data center, suddenly the sky, the heavens opened and now we're fine. Actually, AI expresses itself through its application. it's not about having AI, it's about having better health services. It's not about having AI, it's about having better educational services. It's about having better public services, about having better government administration. Now, sometimes we put the solution before the problem, and we say, like, now have AI, and we'll resolve everything with AI. Even the situations let's be open when AI is not even ready or not even the best tool yet to resolve those topics. And I think that's where, kind of, sometimes to bring back that discussion and try
C'est comme ça qu'il faut recentrer la question sur ce qui compte. Il faut résoudre les vrais problèmes. Et c'est pour cela que je suis très fier d'avoir mené ce groupe de travail sur l'IA aux Nations Unies, qui rassemble toutes les agences, les 53 de ce nom, pour voir comment on peut avancer. L'autre idée, c'est ce n'est pas que l'on a parlé que des centres de données. Ce n'est pas seul.
AI in child protection, AI in education, to really thinking the application level. And we as ATU now work through World Health Organization and WIPO, for example, on AI in health. We have another initiative with Food and Agriculture Organization and IFAD on AI in agriculture, another on emergency communications with our colleagues in WMO and others. So I think really looking in that kind of application level. And when you look at the application level, then you have to start thinking questions. Where do you need your own data center? Where you need a large language model? Where do you need a tiny ML, where you need other things that can service the needs of your country in the best possible way, in the most efficient way. And then, of course, then you have these different solutions that countries create. You mentioned India, so, famous example, Aadhaar or UPI, were created for the country, in the country context. And actually now we talk a lot about DPIs as a concept, digital public infrastructure, that could travel and other countries need to choose. But it's not about choosing again between the stacks, it's kind of really thinking, what, if you look back from the government perspective and you need to service the population's needs, how to service those needs better. Now, coming back to this ingenuity, and I think also sometimes we undervalue how much ingenuity is already coming from everywhere. Like NITU have under our AI for Good platform a number of these competitions. We have our Innovation Factory, where startups pitch. We have our AI machine learning competitions where coders from around the world build the code to resolve different solutions in a kind of hackathon type environment. We have our robotics for youth, where in the countries where they actually secondary school kids are kind of using robots to try to resolve real world challenges, and they come to Geneva to compete. And when you see who are winning those and who are bringing those solutions to the table, a lot of people from all around the world. The winner of our innovation factories, South Africa and Tanzania app, Mama Made, on maternity health in that very specific context. So this thing is happening, and that's where I'm back again. We need to have foundations there. We need to empower people to do it. We need to not to underestimate how much already is there, especially in terms of talent and ingenuity, but also, and I'll bring back, we also shouldn't talk about that in a, isolationist way. And it's the problem, the challenges on the geopolitics, that we kind of then immediately see which country will win. But more like thinking, how do we, rather than talking who will win, thinking about how we serve the needs of a population in a better way. Thank you.
I think that I will take off my moderator hat for 30 seconds. That really echoes one of our key issues when we were preparing the Paris AI Action Summit that I had the chance to work on with the Paris Peace Forum. We were back then the country with the highest rate of AI skepticism, if I should say. I think the number was 56% of the French thought AI was a bad thing per se and should not be developed. And not because 56% are wrong, but because those 56% didn't see in their lives, in their daily lives, in their in real life, what AI could do for them. And I think one of the works we launched, and that India is going to amplify with this notion of impact, is to boost application that can actually help governments deliver for its people. The UK, we were discussing that with Chris, has a lead on that. But the headlines I was dreaming for the AI Summit was not 109 billion invested in data centers in France, although it's great. It was thanks to an AI system of patients triage, a mother and child unit reopens in rural France or something to give better service. And I think that's also the next frontier, both in the global south and in Europe as well. Gabriela, sorry.
Well, I think that's the conversation that we need to have. Because at the end, as I said, it's not that we are discussing AI in a vacuum. We are discussing AI in a context where we still having this very important task of advancing development. And therefore, what happens is that because AI is so blunt and so fast and so impressively disruptive, And even if you don't want it, it's already there in the education systems, it's already there in the workplace, it's already there, and we don't know what kind of AI, but it's already there. But when you really confront that and you see yourself in the mirror to see if you are really ready for this very highly technological world, and you invest less than 4% in the education systems, or you invest less than 1% in R&D, like many countries, or you don't have the public digital infrastructure, as India was so impressive. And therefore, I feel that it's also a reminder of our own homework. And our own homework is to go for those things that maybe are not even related to AI, but that we need to do. I mean, there are many countries that are still investing more in fossil fuels than in education. Has nothing to do with AI. But at the end, these things need to give us almost like a roadmap on how to move forward. And I feel that that's the question. That is a call to ensure that we continue with investments in infrastructure, that we think about what kind of talents we need that are changing, because at the end, one of the most challenging tasks that governments have is how to adapt the education systems. Education systems all over the world are based on memorization and gathering information instead of critical thinking and the things that we know need to be adapted. So I feel that this is a very important point. But from the work that we did at UNESCO, which I feel is a real homework to be advanced, is a question of culture. Because at the end, when you think about, I am speaking now with you in English, pero soy mexicana. And I love Spanish, so I feel more comfortable in Spanish. I can speak French because I have been living in beautiful French 20 years. The fact is that language is not a tool to communicate. It's a mind frame. It's a way to thinking about the world. It's our identity. And therefore, if all of these developments are done in another language, which we all understand, it's not about the utility of having English or not. It's the fact that we are representing a world that is not really including our mindset. And therefore, one of the biggest challenges for us is to ensure that our language, our culture is represented in the developments of these technologies. And this needs to be done by yourselves. And you know, I was super happy that I don't know if we have here some of our friends, because what we did with and Paola is there, what we did with the 80 RAMs, differently from what the international institutions do that is very fast. No, okay, let's do the RAMs. Bring me the best experts in the world to do the RAMs. No. I went to the countries, I went to Kenya, I went to Senegal, I went to Chile, and I said, who is your greatest expert, Chilean, Mexican, on AI? To do the RAM, because I want him to understand, or her, to understand the culture, to understand the language, to understand the mindset, to understand where this country wants to go. And I was so proud because the Latin Americans, Minister Echavarri from Chile, she said, yes, you know, with generative AI, but I mean, for God's sake, Spanish is the third language of the world, and we don't have a ChatGPT in Spanish. What is this? And we launched it. LATAM ChatGPT. You know how? Which is also another very important point that you're doing, bringing and pulling resources together. Not all the countries need to have data centers. Not all the countries need to build computing, but we can pull it together. And in that context, the LATAM ChatGPT was launched by all of the region in Latin America. Surprise, surprise, it's not about the technology. When I asked the minister, how do we go for data flow and exchange among countries? You know what? In the Latin American region, where we have 30, 40 countries, only 2 have agreements to exchange data. So you go back to basics. But at the end is the question of challenging ourselves in terms of how much we can invest in ourselves to use these technologies. And this is what the RAM delivered.
I am sure that Chris, as a Francophile and French-speaking Brit, wants to chime in on this issue of cultural diversity and local ownership.
Mais bien sûr. Merci pour la parole. I actually want to pull it back to where Kate started with innovation, because I think if we lose sight of the role of innovation, in driving value and in creating opportunities and in creating solutions, then, we kind of miss the point. And I think this idea of scarcity driving innovation, like that should be familiar to anyone in tech, right? Because the early days, if you go back to the early days of tech, it was those constraints in memory and other such things.
It started in the garage, right?
Right.
At
and
Microsoft.
It was like, what do I do? I've got 2K, but I want to fly to the moon. And people did it, and they did it through innovation and ingenuity, and that's evidently what's happening, right? And that power of human imagination is still at the heart of this endeavor, right? We shouldn't lose sight of that. And there are many different models, right? Many of them being created in different parts of the world. We should disabuse ourselves of the idea that there's sort of 4 models being offered to the world. On Microsoft's platform Azure, we got over 1,000 that you can select, in different uses. There are clearly models, small language models being developed that can run on laptops and this sort of thing. But what I would actually just have a bit of, just to finish that point, like if that's going to drive innovation, that's going to create jobs, that's going to create value, that's going to build a local ecosystem in places that need one, that's then going to get a snowball effect, that is success, I think, because that is where the value will really be created. But at the same time, I'd be worried if we kind of satisfy ourselves with the idea that some parts of the world will be served okay by a second best solution, because it's clear that access to high performance compute and the cloud, I would say this, wouldn't I, because this is what my company produces, but we would say that there are clear benefits to this. And let's think about things like on the cybersecurity side, for example, where there's huge vulnerabilities across old equipment that can be patched very, very quickly and addressed very, very quickly and protected from threats with a shift to the cloud. So there are benefits to the cloud. That's why we shouldn't lose sight of that first best solution being diffused throughout the world. But then just to return to the language point, or maybe it's a broader point. Maybe it's a point about understanding and engaging with a global population of huge diversity on questions of data and data governance. Because there is more than an infrastructure story here. There's also the question of data and data governance. Now, we just had over a year ago the Global Digital Compact agreed. That launched a process in Geneva at the CSTD that brings together every country, because the UN is universal, for a discussion about data governance. And in that conversation, these questions like sovereignty are being addressed in whole new and interesting ways. It's not just the question of, of my language. It's not just the question of, maybe sovereignty as we might consider it in Europe. It's thinking about, data in a kind of equitable way. It's thinking about things like this idea of, digital colonialism, which is an idea that kind of emerges. And like those issues are being discussed and being thrashed through. And I'm really, really pleased that Microsoft is one of the business reps we're engaging in that process. Because if we don't understand what people need in terms of data, if we don't understand where data is being created, then the innovation is not going to happen. And I think language is a lovely illustration of it, but it's way more than language. It's culture as well. I'm an Englishman. If ChatGPT tells me to go and buy a hot dog, I'm not going to be happy because I want to eat a Cornish pasty. If similarly in Swahili it's saying the same thing, go to CVS and buy it's not going to work, right? So we've got to understand how we make this truly accessible, because this is clearly one of the barriers to adoption.
One footnote to that before I open the floor. I think Kate's trajectory and presence among us also shows the role of this kind of techno-diasporas. Kate, you lived in the US, in Nairobi, in Centrafrique, in France, in Japan. Many of people writing the future of AI are building companies now in Africa, but with a Silicon Valley background. Think of Mustafa Cissé, former vice president at Google, and many others. And it's not, we humans are not made, or even our own identities are not one. And maybe this is also a factor of hope. we have 15 minutes left, and I don't want to frustrate our audience anymore. Please, madam.
What about ethics in AI? Ethics.
What about ethics in AI? I think this is the future. We need to work on ethics. I'm a lawyer. We need to work on codifying ethics on AI. And like Madame Ramos said, only 22% of women are in the business of AI, but 90% of online violence is against women. So we need to work on this.
Maybe we take a couple, so then everyone can react. Madame?
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back on the issue of women and focus on low and middle income countries. What strategies can governments in those countries put in place to ensure that women are not just users of AI, but also shaping, creating, and leading in that area? Thank you.
Madame.
I wanted to ask can you hear me now? I wanted to ask about the issue with the mental health issues. For a long time, we've said low and middle income countries are going to all be cared for in mental health by using AI. It's not going to happen. And we've seen the danger of that now in the US and other places. But the ethics go beyond even our gender and our identity. It goes into the safety of who's creating what kind of mechanism, and it goes into the language. So if we heal in our mother tongue, we have to create that healing process in the AI system. I don't know how to do it, but it has to be there, because that's the future of where the world can go.
It's fascinating, like this first three questions, maybe we first answer them all around how do you embed by design inclusivity, gender balance into innovation?
Maybe I can start because ethics was mentioned, and the recommendation of UNESCO is about ethics. And let me tell you that I moved from the OECD, which is economics, and then I was sitting there with 24 experts all around the world, and the recommendation was ethically developed because they were from all over the world, multidisciplinary. Me, that I was more on the economics. Suddenly, I'm with the philosophers, and I'm with the sociologists, psychologists, but also with people that will raise their hand and say, "Do we really need AI?" So we take the conversation somewhere else. The question of how do we translate the ethical framework, meaning the moral grounds in which we base the decision making in developing whatever we do, but particularly the technologies, into positive outcomes for people, because that was the mindset. It's not about chasing the technology, it's about what positive outcomes can we get out of this, and how do we control by design the kind of inequalities and imbalances that we see. Very importantly, you can correct a lot of biases by having more women in the development teams. I remember still doing a report on digital and AI for the Argentinian presidency in the G20, and 80% of all the downloads of the R data sets at that moment were done by male-only teams from the global north. Nothing wrong with it, but no diversity, and therefore you cannot embed this consciousness of what kind of outcome you will get. And that's why I love the red teaming, because the red teaming is not only by control and command, and is by people understanding that whatever they do in these developments will have an outcome, and they need to be conscious about their own responsibilities of putting technologies in the market that are really delivering. And this goes perfectly in line with, of course, the Women for Ethical AI. That's a battle that we have, and I launched this Women for Ethical AI movement to ensure that governments invest more in women engineers, that of course companies, as I said, 22% of the workforce that develop the technologies are women, and therefore we really need to look into that, because it's fantastic, because if you go for gender equality, you are putting a very important guardrail in terms of these developments. Look at the societies, the way they treat women is not about women, It's about sustainable and inclusive societies, and therefore this is just one proof of how we can make it better. And then by design, this question of mental health, I'm always thinking how, and Chris, maybe you can answer to that, because I'm always thinking, oh yes, no, it's really taking us to a place we don't want to go. Whenever you see that more and more people are using ChatGPT as their therapist, then why do we develop tools that look so human? Why don't we do developments that remind you that this is a tool, a technology? That don't say, hello, Gabriela, how are you today? Are you feeling good? No way, don't do it. The other point, the question of social networks, no? You get into the scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and you get addicted. Why don't you introduce technological solutions like after 20, 30, 1 hour, I don't know, of scrolling, start to slow down? You can do that. Forget about the likes. You know that? That was a report that I saw by one of these fantastic technologists. Let's just slow down the scrolling down and you will get less addiction. Let's just be conscious about the way we develop these technologies and the impact they have, and this is all about ethics.
Kate, I'm going to be super provocative. If innovation is driven by scarcity, is there a better chance that you end up with life-changing solutions instead of Italian brain rots or stuff like that?
Indeed, but maybe just to answer the question around women and what we're doing in our company, I think it's all about increasing the pool of builders, right? So that then you can increase the pool of users and such, because you usually build technology that looks like you. So in our company, we have 70% of women in executive positions, and right now we've achieved parity 50-50, actually 52% women and 48% men in the whole of the company. But more than that, you know, it's I think everybody in the ecosystem has a role to play, and it's up to you to kind of drive this forward. So we partnered with a company called Kallot, and the founder is right here, and we opened a couple of weeks ago an AI hub in Nairobi. And then following this, we launched a women fellowship program, and we've had hundreds of applications from women researchers in AI who have been doing amazing work across the entirety of the continent. So we need more of that, and it's our duty to pay it forward, us who are having a platform and are able to advance and take on board everybody else with us. And I think that's the only way we will actually collectively reach those goals.
Thomas and Chris?
So thank you very much. And of course, on ethics, as Gabriela is an expert, so I won't talk that much. Of course, on the tools side, though, I should say there are some tools, you know, like just a personal experience. On my iPhone, I do have my social media time limit, you know. I have to say I do override it way too often, you know. But I think you also have to accept our own limitations, you know, in using some of the tools. But now on the inclusion of women in the process, and I think Gabriela already mentioned 22%. You know, and generally, if you look at every statistics, women in ICT leadership and AI is always below 25%. And of course, this is a challenge. I think what Kate and Gabriela also said, that is sort of reflective then in results in how the technology works. You know, so 45% of AI models exhibit gender bias. You know, and we have that. And if those models are not rated by enough women, or if women's input, of course, they naturally will have this bias. So how do you correct on that? I think there's a few things just would be very practical that we do from my perspective. One is raising the awareness and really kind of making the mark on that way. So by the way, if you don't know, there is this every Thursday of every April every year, every fourth Thursday actually, every April every year is a Girls on ICT Day that's celebrated very much around the world, with a lot of countries having national celebrations to raise awareness of how to engage girls and women in the ICT development. And we have now this really strong movement there. We have also strong women leaders in ICT field. You know, I have a couple of them next to me, but of course ITU has a first women secretary general now in 160 years history. So we have this women role models. We're trying to create more through the network of women ministers in digital. So really to demonstrate that these are the careers that can be chosen, you know, and that these are careers don't have a gender, you know, and we really do more on that. And then of course, trying to really see how to kind of change curriculums and help in that regard. We have our Equals Coalition, long-standing one, I think more than 20 years now, with industry partners as well, where we again look into the barriers of of women inclusion, especially across the skills, and how to overcome that. So the things are happening and changing, probably not fast enough as always, but I think we really need to work together to make sure it happens. Thank you.
France appointed the first ever female AI minister, and she's been succeeded by another woman, Chris.
This is great. I feel like I was watching a panel earlier where someone made the point that we need to distinguish sometimes between what are societal problems that exist already, what are new problems that may be arising from technology, where there may be an intersection between the two, where technology is making some societal issues harder. It's worthwhile applying that lens sometimes. And I think on gender inclusion, I always stop and take a step back and think about this fundamental question of girls' access to education, which is like such a terrible, you all have the numbers on this, I'm sure, Gabriella, such a terrible situation globally already, right? And, if there is some way that technology can address that, for example, through, distance access to learning or maybe empowering schools through the new technologies, like that's a net gain for society. But our fundamental objective, and this is the economist in me thinking, talent is distributed normally across society. We must assume that. We must therefore try and get all of society engaging in this innovation and this economic activity if we want to get the results. And how do we get women and girls engaging with this technology in an innovative way that's going to give them jobs and give them a future? I think that's the lens we should look through. Ethics, I'm not going to add anything because I'm sitting next to Gabriella, who's the expert on it. But when you sit in a company, of course, you have to have a framework for responsible behavior, and that's the lens really that we look through for that. And I think most tech companies do. We've been on a journey since 2017-18 to design a responsible AI framework. We've got these practices like red teaming, which everyone will talk about. We have assessments. We had a human rights assessment that was done that's driven a lot of our work, and we publish our methodology, so there's transparency about how we're approaching these things. That's how you have to codify this, when at the end what this comes down to is engineers thinking about solutions, and they're not philosophers or ethicists. They need real guidance that they can apply, and that's how we think about that.
Friends, AI has this weird property to accelerate time, and this hour has just gone by without us even realizing. I owe an apology to our audience for not taking more questions. A big thanks to our 4 speakers today. I think it was fascinating to see this conversation evolving from a logic of access and sovereignty to notions of resilience, agency, inclusion, which shows how rich and multi-layered this debate on AI and development and innovation is. We have exciting conferences ahead of us. The Indian AI Impact Summit, where I guess a lot of you will gather again next May in Nairobi. The Africa Forward Summit will gather under the Kenyan and French presidency a number of countries to continue this conversation. Then we'll have the G7 in Evian. This is still work in progress, but I think this conversation will leave you all on a hopeful and optimistic note. Thank you so much to everyone again, and à bientôt.